being a prime is not the risk-free approach for defense procurement. That, the era of peace that we thought that we were in was perhaps just a transitory thing. We're seeing that great power conflicts are still alive and well, and that we have not quite reached the end of history. We strongly believe that Canada should be able to fend for itself, and we're building this sovereign capability. Be it from Ukraine, Germany, Czechia, Canada, the United States, everyone is interested in low-cost missiles. I think everyone, or the vast majority of people, understand that things cannot continue as they have.
Welcome to Chapter 1 of the Canadian Explorers. I'm joined by, is it Paul Ziadé?
Ziadé,
who is the co-chair of the Alliance of Canadian Defence Companies and the co-founder and CEO of North Vector Dynamics, a Canadian air defence startup that exited stealth almost a year ago to protect Canada and its allies. The motto is to industrialize deterrence. So do you want to introduce yourself? Walk me through what all this really means.
Yeah, pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much. So co-founded North Vector Dynamics. Technically, our inception was back in 2022. We used to do a bunch of work with the likes of Defense Research and Development Canada, Raytheon, and so on. Started working in the air defense space in 2024, and happy to kind of dig into the why and the how. But kind of at a very high level, I mean, we're doing what we're doing because, you're seeing what's happening in Ukraine since 2022, arguably since the mid-2010s. Obviously, the world has changed quite a bit. That the era of peace that we thought that we were in was perhaps just a transitory thing. We're seeing that great power conflicts are still alive and well, and that we have not quite reached the end of history. Looking at Canada, it's definitely it's inevitable to see that we've kind of lagged behind in many parts of our defense capabilities. And so for us, the three co-founders were all aerospace engineers by training, and we thought that we had a lot to contribute in this space. And so this is what we're building. Basically, at a very high level, we're building very miniaturized precision-guided missiles for air defense. So think your Shahed drones or counter-rocket artillery mortar, things like that. We strongly believe that Canada should be able to fend for itself, and we're building this sovereign capability.
Do you want to walk me through what your product lineup is?
Sure. So our main product offering is the CM70 missile, which is right behind me. So it's a miniaturized precision-guided missile made right here in Calgary, Alberta. So it has a range of roughly 3 kilometers, can operate in contested environments. It's 2 kilograms in mass, 72 centimeters in length, a 70 millimeter missile. The fact that it is so small opens up a lot of really interesting concepts of operations that are not typically available to traditional air defense systems. And so you could put this on a UAV platform that is relatively small. You can put it on a UGV, a USV, and we're working on all of these integrations right now. We've done our first UAV launches of our missile. So this is very much the key product here. The name of the game with this, definitely with this asymmetric warfare that we're seeing around the world, is to be able to produce these at very low cost and at scale. There are no exquisite components in here. We do a lot of the IP in-house. So everything from the seeker board to the flight controller, the guidance navigation control algorithms, the safe and arm device for the warhead, this is all done right here in Calgary. We feel that it is very important to do such things on our own terms and try to bring as much of that supply chain back here to Canada. In terms of other product offerings, so we do have a hypersonics play as well. So we are Canadian subject matter experts in hypersonics, and we're developing a hypersonic scramjet engine. So scramjet stands for supersonic combustion ramjet. And so ramjets are engines that are meant to fly at supersonic and hypersonic speeds. Well, the scramjets are, at least. They're quite unique in the fact that they're quite efficient at these very high speeds and they have no moving parts. Um, and so Canada does not have its own hypersonic capabilities either. For us, we see hypersonics as being kind of the next threat beyond, the drone threat. It's at the other end of the spectrum, Mach 5 and above. Arguably, Canada and its allies are quite a bit behind compared to China and Russia. And so this is something that we're working on over the longer term. We did have some other product offerings in the autonomous system space. They are still on offer, but we are not pushing them as hard as before, just because right now, with all of the partners that we're talking to, be it from Ukraine, Germany, Czechia, Canada, the United States, everyone is interested in low-cost missiles. So we're really doubling down on this play.
So your motto, industrialize, deterrence. This is what you mean when you're talking about like cheap drones, building them fast, building them at scale, and having that vertical integration. Can you touch upon like what that really means, why it's important for Canada?
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing is that modern warfare in the 21st century is very different from what we saw in the 20th century, right? It's no longer these exquisite systems, and it's kind of a bit of an opportunity for Canada as well, because we don't need to concern ourselves as much with some of these multi-billion-dollar 10-year procurement cycles to procure, not that we ever or that we have aircraft carriers, but these very large systems, be they submarine, 6th-gen fighter aircraft, and so on and so forth. They're always going to have a place. Don't get me wrong with that. But in the 21st century, what we're seeing is that wars are being fought with autonomous systems in cyberspace as well. And these are things where Canada has traditionally excelled in robotics, cyber, AI, and so on. And so it's an opportunity for us to really step up to the plate here, and because we are starting on the back foot in a traditional military sense, right? We do not have large scale capacity to build these very expensive programs like they do in the United States and in China. So for us, at least in the defensive space and air defense, industrializing deterrence means basically, having the capability to scale up our defenses on our own terms, not having to ask for permission, whether that be vendor lock-in with an ally or something like that, that we own the supply chain as much as possible. And, from an air defense perspective, at least, but I guess we could make it broader, is that we would want to become a prickly porcupine, as I say. So you want to deter and discourage people from attacking Canada, whether that be in cyberspace or in physical space, by having the best defenses possible.
Yeah. Well, definitely right now, we're seeing in Iran and in Ukraine, like this being an immediate threat. I think for most people, when they're looking at Canada, they wouldn't assume that Canada would be at immediate threat for a domestic air defense attack. However, right now we're seeing people being able to build like 3D missiles and drones, or 3D print missiles and drones, or you were talking about before how people can send in shipping containers that contain these drones. How close are we to potentially having that domestic threat? And if it happened right now, what would we do?
That's a very good question. I think your guess is as good as mine. I'm not privy to a lot of the information and the threat landscape that maybe our intelligence agencies might have. But I think it's a real threat, and it doesn't necessarily have to come from foreign actors, right? I mean, you're looking at FIFA World Cup; they're going to have counter UAS measures as well, right? Think north warning systems, correctional facilities, nuclear power plants, oil refineries, so on and so forth. I think it's a real threat. Definitely, yeah. We only inspect something on the order of 1% of our shipping containers that come in to Canada. The United States is not much better, and so I think it's definitely worth Canada acting with a bit more urgency with this. I know that there are a lot of things happening in the background in the counter UAS and air defense space, and so they are not neglecting it for sure. I think definitely we would like to see more of a posture of urgency in this space, because for us, it is not just a theoretical faraway threat that only exists in, active theaters like Ukraine or the Middle East, but there's no reason why these things cannot come to our shores as well.
What you're talking about with the FIFA World Cup, is your um, customer base potentially not only in the government? Are you also targeting like airports and these type of things, or are you focused mostly on Canada?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think so. Firstly, I would say we are focused not just on Canada, but right now, obviously, the most apparent market for us is governments and militaries. Um, you talk to different people, and they will say, no, we will start seeing kinetic countermeasures in civilian areas for counter UAS. People within the military are saying that. Right now, it's a little bit difficult, just from a regulatory perspective. I think even a lot of people in the civilian space who say, hey, we need counter UAS, they just don't know how to actually navigate this threat from a regulatory perspective. Hey, can you do jamming or directed energy in an urban center? I don't know about that, right? I think so. There's a lot of catching up that needs to be done right now in that regard. But we definitely see a play, whether it be protecting ships in the Red Sea, that are being attacked, right? So it's not necessarily a military play, it is a commercial play, but definitely you're going to start seeing more and more applications of air defense and counter UAS in these defense adjacent areas.
Yeah, you probably can't have your average business shooting a missile at a drone.
Unfortunately, yeah, no. I guess unfortunately for us, no, but I think it's probably a good thing in the end, yeah.
Yeah, so in Canada, it takes, I believe, on average, like 16 years to go through the procurement cycle right now. So when you're talking about industrializing deterrence, building up these systems quick, I mean, I believe that's difficult right now. We don't have a fast-tracked procurement system or anything like that. Do you see this changing right now with everything that's going on in Canada, with the defense industrial strategy or the DIA?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I would say that my outlook is one of cautious optimism. I've had one-on-ones with Secretary of State Fuhr, and the PMO is aware of us and of what we're doing through ACDC and so on. I think everyone, or the vast majority of people, understand that things cannot continue as they have, right? Um, and so I think things are changing and moving in the right direction. So originally, the DIA was only going to start looking at contracts at $100 million and above. They're reducing that threshold, which is great. I think they are looking at bringing some of the best practices from other jurisdictions. So I know someone trying to bring the InQtel model up to Canada through one of our defense units as well. And so I think there's a lot happening in the background. I hope it's going to move very quickly, because there's a lot of really, really interesting defense startups and small businesses in Canada that cannot depend on these, 10, 15-year procurement cycle. So, we need to move quickly. So no, I am cautiously optimistic for sure. The DIS, in my opinion, hits many of the right notes. I think, they're looking to bring procurement up to 70% going to Canadian companies, which is great. For us to be able to achieve that at the scale that of our defense spending will definitely require reforms in procurement, because I think the money and getting the budget approved is one thing, but the real challenge is actually getting the money out the door. And so one initiative that I'm working on is kind of like starting to recast what risk in procurement actually means, because the default assumption is that going with the legacy players is the de-risked play. And I very much want to challenge that, especially in 21st century warfare. And so, you could look at a lot of dimensions that affect the risk of a procurement, right? So everything from cost overrun rates, and you can look at, historical data on that, schedule slippage, iteration velocity, right? So how quickly can you get an updated requirement from your end user on the front line and ship an updated product, right? Is there sovereign control risk? Is there technology lock-in risk? Can we update the software, or do we need to get permission from someone else? And you can actually do that in a very data-driven way, just using data that is fairly freely available. And so this is something that I'm working on as well, and to show that for 21st century warfare, being a prime is not the risk-free approach for defense procurement. And there are many more variables that need to be considered. And so I'll be presenting that in the coming weeks. I have a talk that I need to give, and so hopefully it'll be ready by then. And I think there are good people in our government right now who are really looking at different ways of doing things. And I think it's going to come quicker than most people expect. So I'm not that pessimistic about Canada's future in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, even when we look at the US right now and the reliance on primes, like I believe they're nearly out of air defense missiles in the Middle East right now. One thing, could you explain like what that In-Q-Tel model is and what they were talking about bringing to Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know all of the details, honestly speaking, and it's probably not going to look exactly like In-Q-Tel, but I think so. The right way to look at In-Q-Tel is not so much as a venture capital firm, but as an extension of the government. And so it often will come with some sort of contract at the end of that investment. Typically, In-Q-Tel's checks are not that big to begin with. And so, yeah, so there are some initiatives happening in Canada that are really looking to bridge the capital with, that end user. So I can't say too much more on that, partly because it's still in its infancy, and also I'm not directly involved with that.
Okay. And I imagine that talk that you're going to do, is this involved with ACDC? And can you quickly explain what's going on with ACDC?
I think it would be a very good thing to publish through ACDC. So no, this talk is actually, I've been asked to give a talk in Ottawa on rethinking procurement. And so I said, well, I'm not a policy expert, I'm a technologist, right? And, so I said, okay, what can I do that is compelling? And I just decided to do like a very in-depth data analysis on that and kind of try to recast a policy prescription that I'm going to try to present in a very data-driven way, in a way that makes sense to me as an engineer. In terms of what's happening with ACDC, so I mean, this is a very interesting thing. So ACDC, for those who don't know, is the Alliance of Canadian Defense Companies. So it's a relatively new advocacy group. We've only been around for a couple of months now. We have almost 200 members. Basically, the thinking around ACDC is that we needed an advocacy organization that will speak to the concerns and the objectives of Canadian-controlled and Canadian-owned companies. So is the board controlled by Canadians, and are most of the shares owned by Canadians as well? And I think this is a big thing. I talked about risk and, different things like that. And we're talking a lot about sovereignty and more procurements going to Canadian companies. And so we want to hold the government to account through ACDC. We have a very specific definition for what a Canadian company is. It is more than just having a branch plant operation in Canada. If you look at our defense industrial base right now, even though something over 90% of companies are small businesses, mostly Canadian, the vast majority of the contracts are still going to multinationals, at least for some of the big programs. And we want to change that. And again, this is not looking to outright displace the primes. They're always going to have a very important role to play, but Canada can do a lot more in many of the areas that I mentioned, from autonomy to AI to cybersecurity to quantum. We felt from an advocacy perspective that there was a bit of a gap there. Many of the advocacy groups, whether they be at the provincial level or at the federal level, they represent everyone, including the large primes. And we felt that there had to be a very focused voice for Canadian-owned, Canadian-controlled companies. And our mandate is very narrow, so we're not trying to do everything. We're not putting on events that are competitive to some of the other big trade shows or anything like that. Our mandate is narrow. It's basically more contracts to Canadian-owned, Canadian-controlled companies and having those contracts executed a lot faster than currently being done. I think we're pushing 200 companies right now. So there's a lot of interest in what is happening with ACDC and just in general in Canada. I think you're seeing a lot of defense and dual use companies really wanting to play an increasing role in this defense renaissance.
When you look at the investments that the Canadian government are putting into defense right now, there's a big problem with making that money flow into multinational businesses. It means IP exits Canada, the money flows out of Canada, right? There needs to be a focus on building these Canadian companies, Canadian-owned companies, if you want to turn this into a Canadian economic strategy.
That's precisely it, right? If you see defense as an industrial strategy, then you cannot exfiltrate all the wealth to another country, right? And this is the 21st century economy. It's all about IP ownership. It's jobs is just a very narrow part of what makes an economy right now. And so I think there are a lot of very strong voices at the table beyond just ACDC pushing this message. So I think people are starting to pay attention.
I wanted to quickly, before we get too far, flow into you, Paul. I want to know, like, when you were a kid, what were your dreams? Did you always know you wanted to be a builder? And like, how did that take you to where you are now?
That's a good question. Did I always know I wanted to be a builder? Perhaps to an extent, yes. I mean, I didn't know what I wanted to do until about grade 11 of high school, but I always kind of, at first I wanted to be an architect and, obviously building something, right? Create that art, creating something new. I think that was always something that was very interesting to me. I was always playing with Legos as a kid, of course, just building stuff. Once I got to high school, I was making my own solid rocket motors in the chemistry lab. So got really into rocketry. And so I think I was always, to an extent, destined to do something like this. It took a long time. I spent 4 years in nuclear engineering. Then I spent almost a decade as a professor. I left that position. There was always an element of building and creation in all of these jobs. So don't get me wrong. So I think what really drew me to engineering was, seeing what NASA was doing with the space shuttle. I think that was always incredibly intriguing to me. I visited Kennedy Space Center and that just kind of opened my eyes. And then once I knew what I wanted to do, I just really went for it. And as I said, got massively into rocketry in high school. And so it was inevitable that I would probably go into engineering. I wasn't pushed into it by anyone. My father's an engineer, but so I think probably some of that rubbed off on me to an extent, but never in a very direct and coercive way. So it took me a long time. I mean, like Waterloo is known as a very entrepreneurial university, but none of that rubbed off on me when I was there. I went a very academic route instead. But as I said earlier, I think perhaps it was inevitable that I would end up where I am today.
Like, it was inevitable that you would end up starting your own company?
Yeah, probably. Whether I knew it or not, I think it was probably inevitable.
Did you always feel like you didn't fit in quite well on the other, more corporate path? Like, how did you realize this?
Yeah, I mean, like the definitely like the corporate path, especially when you're working for a large company, you end up working in a very narrow field. You are the guy who does this one thing, and that's it. And that got really boring for me. I think In terms of the fit, yeah, I mean, I think I did fit in well in academia. Don't get me wrong. It was a great career. Definitely very highly politicized, as with any large corporate structure. I think probably why I'm saying it's inevitable that I became an entrepreneur is, uh, just like I got bored in the corporate world, I got bored after a while at the university. You reached a plateau and then you can only do so much, right? And, there's a saying that the stakes in academia are, um, the politics in academia are so cutthroat because the stakes are so low. And so I definitely saw that, you know, uh, and so I said, okay, what's next for me? And I think with entrepreneurship, there's no real ceiling in terms of, if you're a founder, you can say, I'm building this. And then a few years, if you want to pivot and do something else, I think it's quite possible, and I think there's massive upside compared to what you can do in a large corporate structure. So I think right now I'm very happy where I am. I'm by no means bored with what I'm doing. It's incredibly exciting. And I think I'm where I'm supposed to be right now.
Yeah, and when you're looking at North Vector and starting this, what came first? Did you say like, I want to be an entrepreneur, or did you say, there's this idea, nobody's doing it, I have to do it to fill that gap?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think it has to be a little bit of both. I think you need to, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, I think you need to want to have that drive to kind of, I don't know, maybe not fit into a big corporate structure, not have a boss. I don't know. For me, that became a pretty big thing, leaving the university, is that I just didn't, um, I didn't like playing the game so much. But I think you also need to be very product led. And we are a very technical team here at North Vector Dynamics. We saw, hey, we want to build some of the coolest stuff that is currently being built in Canada. So I don't think you can separate the two dimensions there. I was drawn by both.
Yep. I mean, you started North Vector at a time where, Canada wasn't very focused on the defense space or even the startup space very much, but particularly in defense, I think it was nearly impossible to get any investing. How has that changed from then till now? And was there any moment where you thought like, I can't stay in Canada, I have to move somewhere else?
Yeah. So, no, things have definitely changed. We started fundraising for our previous round before anyone would even look at a defense company. And, we're not a dual use company. We are almost uniquely single use. It was very, very difficult to get anyone to pay attention to us. Um, and we got our first few believers who ended up investing. And then this really started moving things in the right direction. And then definitely with government announcements and BDC changing its mandate to allow for defense investments, just accelerated things. And I could tell you, I mean, like right now, everyone wants to participate in this. I can't tell you how many investors I've actually had to turn away, which is, I don't take it for granted at all, because I remember very um, vividly what it was like not even a year ago trying to get investor meetings. Now, in terms of like wanting to move to the States, I would say like it wasn't a very strong pull, but I would be lying if I said that we never thought about, hey, this would just be way easier to to just build in the States. And I think many entrepreneurs, unfortunately, um, they think that in Canada, or they get tempted by it. Not everyone does it necessarily. Um, and so this is probably a call to arms, I guess, for our capital markets, for our government to just say, hey, you know what? We need reforms in how we do things in order to keep our best and brightest and keep the IP and all the wealth creation in Canada. And so, long story short, I mean, yeah, we have thought about it, but not for more than a couple of minutes, really. So, we are quite invested in doing this in Canada, keeping our headquarters in Canada. Obviously, Canada's not going to be our only customer right now. We're in very advanced talks with partners in Germany and Czechia, in the UAE, in the United States. And so this is a global play. But Canada has given us a lot as well. And I think there's a real opportunity to do this here. I think the friction that we experience in Canada is also an opportunity, right? The fact that we do not have a very developed industrial base in defense is an opportunity for builders like ourselves and many other companies to fill that void. It's a combination of headwinds, but also massive opportunities. And now that everyone's also reevaluating their supply chains and where they procure from is also a big chance for Canadian companies to step up on the world stage, right? People are are increasingly becoming economic nationalists, right? Germany wants to procure from Germans and other very friendly countries, and maybe reevaluating, hey, do we procure from the United States? Um, so yeah, I think, long story short, we're very committed to Canada and maintaining our presence here. Um, and there are no immediate or even long-term plans to be moving our company abroad, at least from a headquartered perspective.
Yeah, I mean, if you're comparing Canada to the US, I mean, obviously the US is significantly more capital. I mean, they have a lot of advantages compared to us. But when you look at Canada right now, I think we have the opportunity to build the foundation where the US is already, the industry is very well built out. But in Canada, like you're saying, there's less competition right now because it has been suffocated so much recently. So when you have this sudden turn, this focus on startups in the defense space, it's an opportunity to grow at the beginning of something, which I think has a lot of advantages there. When you're looking at, VCs, investors, the government, um, they're doing a lot right now. There's been a lot of sudden shifts, but are there any immediate changes that you would look for? Anything specific, or anything that maybe other people aren't talking about?
I don't think I would say anything that's original that hasn't been lamented or communicated by others. Definitely on the capital side, I think we need a lot more risk capital in Canada. I think we're still applying, from a personal perspective, I guess, as a builder in defense. I think we're still seeing a lot of investors apply playbooks that just simply don't translate to defense, right? What works for SaaS does not work for a deep tech company working in defense, with the defense procurement cycles that are much, much longer than a direct to consumer play, for example. So there needs to be a mindset and a shift and a cultural change there. On the government front, I mean, we've talked a lot about it. I think definitely one of the things that could be done a lot better, and I know that the CAF is looking at that, is just strengthening their relationship with industry. There's still like there's a big distance between industry and the end user in the CAF. And so we're often building in with blinders on, right? We don't know, hey, are we building something that they might ultimately want? Because this is how defense is happening right now in the 21st century, is that you're not waiting for the RFP to come out to start designing and building your solution. You build the solution first, and then you try to sell it to the government. And so, tightening that relationship between the military and industry is going to be incredibly important, not only for industry to be able to position itself, invest the right capital in the right places, but also to be able to iterate very quickly. And again, it's going to take some time. But we have a lot of really good people in the CAF right now, and I know that they are looking at that and, making access to some of our army bases or our military bases a lot more readily available for testing, for iteration, and yeah, making end users more available for industry as well.
Yeah, I mean, like, I believe in the Ukraine, you have startups testing directly with the military there. I know that's something that Dominion's trying to do a bit right now in Canada. And it's definitely, if we have a program that could help incentivize that, help, these companies and the government work together for aligned goals, having that, communication, it's going to help a ton. On the financial side, I mean, when you look at hardware versus software, I mean, hardware, as you're saying, obviously has way longer timelines. It's way more capital intensive, particularly in defense and energy. I mean, some of these timelines when you're working with the governments are way longer. And when we have so much STEM talent or talent in Canada, right, we want to also have the support for these talented people. We have a ton of talents that may not understand how to work with the government or may not understand how to work with policy. And this might be something that, financial organizations or VC firms have the opportunity to step in, offer that expertise with that financing. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'm bringing this over to NORAD modernization, the Golden Dome. Can you walk me through like what's happening here and what the opportunity for North Vector is and Canada to make the most of these opportunities?
Yeah, so I mean, we still haven't, as a country, fully committed to the Golden Dome, which I would say it's unfortunate. I think it is very much in our interest to have an integrated air defense capability with our neighbors to the south. I think it's a big opportunity for Canada to um, provide its expertise. We have a ton of expertise in whether it be geospatial or satellite imagery, to over the horizon radar and things like that, and to what we're doing here at North Vector Dynamics in like very much in the direct application of air and missile defense. And I mean, if we are going to participate, and Canada stays true to its commitment to buy Canadian and increase the amount of contracts that are going to Canadian companies, that I think is a huge opportunity for many companies beyond just North Vector Dynamics, right? As I said, we have world-class talent in um, all areas that are relevant to air defense. So I think it's a big opportunity. I think Canada should go for it sooner rather than later so that, again, industry can reposition itself, make the appropriate investments before these things are needed, in a few years' time.
Yeah, and can you walk me through like what the future of North Vector Dynamics looks like within this? Hypersonics, you guys are focusing on the Arctic.
Yeah. So, I mean, we are definitely a missile company. This is what we do. Ultimately, what we want to have is products that are being fielded for the entire threat spectrum from the low and slow. So think of your DJI type drones to Shahed drones, all the way to hypersonic threats. Um, there's a lot of, as I said, that vertical integration is also very, very important to us. There's a lot of meat on the bone there. So, I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to, vertically integrate and bring, whether it be into Canada or under North Vector Dynamics, some of the key components like warheads and solid rocket motors and stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done on that front. I can see definitely that we want to also bring under our umbrella some related capabilities. So when you think of counter UAS or air defense, it's not just your interceptor systems, right? You have your initial detection sensors, things like that, command and control. And so we may want to start bringing some of that in-house as well, either through direct R&D and development or acquisition of other companies. Um, yeah, so the hypersonics piece is the long-term play. I think we need to be involved in this space no matter what we do. We are identified by the Canadian government as subject matter experts in this, so that's definitely a core play for North Vector Dynamics. So yeah, are we building a neo prime in Canada? I think we are. I think we're well on our way to doing that. And so that's what the future holds for us. I think, building a very compelling capability and increasingly owning more and more parts of that capability, whether it be radar systems or maybe other types of countermeasures as well, right? So We haven't really talked about that, but when you think about air defense, I mean, interceptors is just one piece of the puzzle. Increasingly, you're seeing directed energy systems, electronic warfare, countermeasures, and these are things that we might also want to bring to market in the medium term.
And you guys are building all these specifically to be able to fit in with like other systems, for example, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So interoperability is massive, and so right now, what we build internally is the countermeasure itself and um, the launch systems, but they slot into um, basically any NATO standard communication protocols, C2 systems, and so on and so forth. It's a fairly agnostic system architecture.
Yeah. So a little bit back into you and your entrepreneurship journey. Like as a founder, this is your first company, right?
Correct. Well, technically my second. So I had another consulting company before, but this is my first one that is venture backed and that we're really looking to scale into something massive.
First startup.
Yeah.
You're doing something that, not many Canadians have done before. When you're dealing with, this constant feeling potentially of unreadiness or putting yourself into new situations, what advice would you give to other first-time founders on how to navigate that, how to do things without permission?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question. I think we're very risk averse in Canada. And I think what I'll probably tell people, I don't know if it's the right term to use, was like, the water's not that cold and just jump in and do it, right? I think what is the worst that's going to happen? I think you had asked me for another piece that you're working on, who's my hero in science or entrepreneurship. And I gave you the example of Oppenheimer, who was an academic like myself, although I do not compare myself in the least to Oppenheimer and his capabilities. And he had the vision and the courage to step out of the confines of academia and the ivory tower to basically lead the Manhattan Project, which is just absolutely huge endeavor, probably quite foreign to him. Has he had at the time he had not really led large teams of people and things like that, but obviously he had a lot of success in the process. Whether we see that success as being a good thing or a bad thing for humanity, that's beyond the point I'm trying to make. So what I would tell kind of first time entrepreneurs, or even whether you're an entrepreneur or not, but you're just trying to step out of your comfort zone, I think you need to ask yourself, like, what is the worst that's going to happen? And maybe optimize not for, or try not to mitigate all of the downside, but think about what the upside could actually be and just kind of jump in, right? I mean, I had a job for life at the university as a tenured academic, and I left that because I see that the upside in what I'm building is incredibly exciting, and the alternative is just kind of comfort, and that's just not very. I mean, for some people that's perfectly fine, and I there's no judgment around that. But I think generally speaking, we as a country are a bit too risk averse, and I think we should be optimizing and thinking about what is the best that could happen instead of what is the worst, or what are the worst things that could happen.
Yeah, not what if it all goes wrong, but what if it all goes right. I've been for the Canadian Explorers, I've been adding for the slogan "Fortune favors the bold," which I believe was an old Robin saying, but I think it's very true. The more bold you are, the more you are prepared to take action, to be confident, to be courageous. The
Yep.
more luck comes your way. You open yourself to more possibilities, at least, of receiving that luck. On the topic of this for Canada, I believe we've had a lot of situations in the past where we've made big promises. So how can we make sure, this isn't just a moment where we decide we're going to focus on startups or on defense? Like, how do we make sure we actually follow through with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what our government does from a policy perspective is probably downstream from culture, I would say. And so it's all about changing the culture. And that's why, people, I don't need to name names necessarily, but people in this startup and defense space, they're doing a lot from the advocacy perspective, becoming more public thought leaders in the space, because I think if you can get the general population to buy into what it is that you are selling, which is basically entrepreneurship is incredibly important. Defense is incredibly important. And not only from a sovereign perspective, but also from as an economic force multiplier and so on and so forth, then the government will respond to what, or ideally the government will respond to what the general public all feel is a national imperative. And so I think we need to work a lot, and this is, something that you're doing, which is incredibly important. The people at like Build Canada, I would like to think ACDC as well, is just changing the culture and making sure that the people are aware of the importance of sovereign entrepreneurship, capital markets, defense, what have you.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we miss in Canada a bit is that we are hyper policy focused. We're focused on a lot of the times the thinkers and the politicians, the people that watch things, and we often look at them and we say, hey, fix all our problems for us. But I think in Canada we need the actors and the doers, the people actually like stepping in to do something, to have the voice, and the culture needs to come from that area. I mean, I think that's how you really get change done. When you talked about this last time, how over a few years Germany had several unicorns pop up in the defense industry. On the topic of that, how does Canada start dreaming bigger? How do we say like it's approachable for us to have several unicorns come out of this industry, and it's not just like a fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things need to happen. So, I mean, obviously, government needs to become a much better customer for domestic companies. I think that's one thing. I think if we want to build unicorns, I think, again, I mentioned the capital markets is going to be a big one, right? And I've experienced this myself, right? If accessing capital is a lot more frictionless south of the border, then people are going to go there, right? And so things have to change on this front as well. Having spent almost 10 years as a professor, I can tell you that there's no shortage of talent in our universities. I've been associated with 3 post-secondary institutions, and I think we have all of the ingredients to be building massive companies here. I think it's creating the business environment that makes it attractive to remain in Canada and build here, unlocking the capital, which is a second leg of the stool. And many people more informed and more eloquent than myself can tell you why that is important. I think for us, I think it definitely, there is a lot of friction in Canada. The playbook is not there for many companies, especially working in deep tech. And then the final one is, having our government be one of the best customers possible. Right now, as I mentioned earlier in the call, like our first sales are likely not going to be to Canada, and that's not for lack of trying, but it's just other people are moving a lot more quickly in different markets. And so as a builder, as an entrepreneur, I need to do what's best for my company, and sometimes it is, we just kind of have to go where the opportunities are. So I believe these 3 things will definitely help to unlock certain things, and again, changing the culture. I think culture is upstream to so many different things. And so and I think if a few people are starting to make these moves and saying, hey, look, we can do this here, obviously you have the Shopify example. That's a big one. You have the Cohere guys as well doing something really big. Elliot at Dominion Dynamics is taking a very big swing. I think they're going to lay the groundwork and show the path for a lot of people to follow.
Yeah, and I guess not only telling people that it's possible, but actually demonstrating it. If you see a few companies becoming successful in Canada in this industry, it's something that other people will follow. So when everything is all said and done, everything that you've built in your lifetime, what do you want your legacy to be with North Vector, with everything that you've done?
Well, that's a very good question. What do I want my legacy to be after all said? I guess people can have multiple legacies, perhaps, because I still see, maybe this is not the right thing to say as an entrepreneur, but like I'm first and foremost a husband and a father, and so my legacy is my children and what I'm building at home. You know, so what I really enjoyed being a professor more than anything was um, working with young people and showing young people, mentoring them, whether it be on their research projects or engineering projects, or just helping them to figure out how to think about a difficult problem, right? And so maybe in my entrepreneurial journey, if the legacy that I leave behind is that I showed younger entrepreneurs that yes, it is doable to build a big company here in Canada. And I did it um, for obviously for a good reason and against all odds, because let's just say building a missile company is probably not as easy to do in Canada than building a software company. I would say not that it's easy to do a software company, but I think the odds are still very much stacked against us. Um, and so, again, if I can show that you can take these risks and be successful, I think that'll be a very good outcome from a legacy perspective.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a terrible thing to say your legacy is your kids and being a husband as well. I mean, it also, I think they work together a little bit. Not only are you showing other young people that you can build a successful company, but your kids are those young people too, right? So lastly, was there anything else that you want to mention? Like any big news coming up, product launches, anything I didn't ask that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, no, I think we've covered a lot on this topic. I think we will have some news to share in the next couple of weeks once that the ink has dried on a very exciting partnership. So there will be some big news there. I think, as I said, there's a ton of interest in what we're building, not only in Canada but in some foreign markets. I think from a Canadian perspective, although I don't think we need to make the case as strongly as maybe we had to 8 or 10 months ago, um, is that again, defense is not a dirty word. I think it, it is one of the basic functions of a country, that we need to be able to defend our own people, our place, what we love, our traditions, and that I think the complacency that we've had as a country in this space, and this is not putting it at the feet of any particular government. I think we've been basically, not paying our bill, at least in the NATO alliance, since I think almost the Mulroney era or something like that. Um, I'm glad to see that that is changing, because we as a country, I think we have a lot to offer the world. I think it is imperative that we do not adopt these luxury beliefs that the end of history has arrived, that we can all be pacifists. I think that is the ideal, of course, but I think human nature being what it is that we are always not very far from direct conflict, and that we cannot delude ourselves into thinking that this cannot also implicate us. And so this is what we're trying to build here. We're trying to say, no, Canada needs to think about this very carefully, and we need to build up our own industrial capability here in Canada. And so, yeah, lots happening in this space, a lot of very exciting companies that we're collaborating with in Canada. And I think it's going to be a very exciting space in the coming few years.
Yeah. I mean, I like to think of where we are as a piece of history, not at the end of it, like you're saying, but there is many generations of people who have built things before us that have laid the groundwork of where we are today. The buildings around us, everything about our world and everything that we build from today has been built from these prior generations. And like them, we are another generation that mix building something on top of what has already been built for something that future generations can use. So we're not the end. We're in the middle between the past and the future. Yeah, but thank you so much for hopping on this call. It's been a great talk.
Thank you, Ethan. It's been a pleasure. And very well said. That last statement was better than I could put it myself. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure.
For everyone watching, stay tuned for the future of the Canadian Explorers. Fortune favors the bold. If you have any suggestions for future guests, reach out. I will also be linking the Canadian Explorers Substack in the description if you want to read more about how Canada can start winning.